The moment someone tells you that you're trespassing on your own family's land, you realize the truth isn't buried in the dirt, it's buried in paperwork. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of my old Ford F-150 as I turned onto the narrow county road I had driven hundreds of times growing up. The familiar scent of fresh-cut hay drifted through the open window, mixing with the earthy smell that always reminded me of my dad's farm after an early spring rain. For a few seconds, everything felt exactly the way I remembered it. The weathered red barn still stood against the morning sky. The old windmill slowly turned in the breeze. Even the massive oak tree near the entrance cast the same shadow across the fence line where my father used to lean while drinking his morning coffee. Then I saw the gate. It wasn't the old steel gate my father welded with his own hands nearly 30 years earlier. That gate was gone. In its place stood a brand new black security gate topped with polished cameras that quietly tracked my truck as I rolled closer. A large stone monument beside the entrance displayed shiny bronze letters that read, Oak Ridge Estates Private Community. I actually laughed because I thought I had taken the wrong road somehow. This couldn't be my family's farm. I eased forward until two men wearing matching security uniforms stepped out of a small guard booth that definitely hadn't existed 6 months earlier. One raised a hand before I even shifted into park. "Sir, stop the vehicle." His voice carried the calm confidence of someone convinced he was completely in charge. I shut off the engine, climbed out, and the cool morning air hit my face. The smell of fresh asphalt lingered around the entrance, replacing the familiar scent of old gravel that had always welcomed me home. Something about that smell instantly made the place feel foreign. "Morning," I said. "I'm Ethan Walker. My father owned this farm. I'm here to check on the property." The older guard glanced at a tablet in his hands before looking back at me without the slightest hint of hesitation. "Mr. Walker, according to our records, you've been permanently banned from entering Oak Ridge Estates." I honestly thought he was joking. "You mean my father's farm?" He simply turned the screen toward me. My name sat there in bold letters beneath a red banner marked "No Entry Authorized." "If you proceed beyond this gate, local law enforcement will be contacted for trespassing." Trespassing? On the land where I learned to ride horses before I was tall enough to reach the stirrups. On the fields where my dad taught me how to fix fences instead of replacing them. On the front porch where my mother watched every 4th of July fireworks show until the year she passed away. I stared past the guards toward the driveway, and that was when I noticed something even worse. The wooden family sign that had always read Walker Family Farm had disappeared. In its place stood another polished HOA sign surrounded by perfectly arranged landscaping that looked like it had been designed from a real estate brochure instead of built by people who actually worked the land. The breeze rustled through the oak tree exactly the way it always had, but everything beneath its branches had changed. And standing there outside a gate that never belonged on my father's property, I realized someone hadn't just taken control of the entrance. They had rewritten the entire story of who this land belonged to. My father, Daniel Walker, used to say that land was the only thing in life that remembered every honest hand that ever cared for it. I never fully understood what he meant when I was a kid because, to me, the farm was simply home. It was 118 acres of rolling pasture outside a small Texas town, with weathered fences that always seemed to need another board replaced, a red barn that smelled of cedar, leather, and fresh hay, and a winding creek where I caught my first base using an old tackle box that still sat somewhere in Dad's workshop. Every season had its own rhythm. Spring brought the scent of bluebonnets and damp soil. Summer filled the air with the steady chorus of cicadas and the distant rumble of tractors working neighboring fields. Autumn covered the property in golden light that stretched across the grass for what felt like forever. Even winter carried its own quiet beauty when frost covered every fence post before sunrise. My earliest memories were never about money or property values. They were about learning how to mend a broken gate instead of buying a new one, checking every fence after a thunderstorm, and sitting on the porch with my father while he pointed toward the horizon and reminded me that everything I could see belonged to our family because somebody had earned it through decades of work instead of shortcuts. After college, I became a civil engineer. My projects took me across Texas, sometimes hundreds of miles from home for weeks at a time, but no matter where I was working, I always found an excuse to drive back on holidays. Dad never complained about the long hours. He would simply hand me another pair of work gloves, and tell me there was always something that needed fixing. When my mother passed away years earlier, the farm became even more important to him. It was where every family photograph had been taken, where every birthday barbecue had happened, and where every holiday somehow ended with everyone gathered around the old oak tree before sunset. 6 months before that morning at the gate, I stood beside my father's hospital bed listening to machines hum softly in the background while he spoke more about the farm than about himself. He never mentioned fear. He never talked about regret. He only reminded me where the property records were stored, where the original survey maps had been locked away, and where the blue metal toolbox sat beneath the workbench inside the barn. At the time, I smiled and promised I would take care of everything, believing there would be plenty of time to organize paperwork later. I had no reason to think anyone would ever question who owned the place. Property taxes had always been paid. The deed had never changed hands. Every fence line matched the county survey that had existed for decades. Standing outside that unfamiliar security gate now, listening to leaves rustle through the same old oak tree my father planted when I was 8 years old, I realized someone had managed to change everything around the farm without changing the land itself. The fields were still there. The creek still reflected the morning sun. The barn still stood beyond the hill. But somehow, while I was grieving my father and trying to settle his affairs, strangers had transformed my family's legacy into something that looked polished, expensive, and completely unrecognizable. The older guard spoke quietly into the radio clipped to his shoulder, and less than a minute later, I heard the low hum of an expensive sport utility vehicle rolling down the freshly paved driveway. The tires barely made a sound on the new asphalt, nothing like the familiar crunch of limestone gravel that used to echo across the front pasture every morning when my father drove out to check the cattle. The white luxury vehicle stopped just inside the gate, and a woman stepped out wearing a cream-colored blazer that looked far more suited to a real estate convention than a working farm. She smiled before she even reached me, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "You must be Ethan Walker," she said, extending a hand I had no intention of shaking. "I am Patricia Collins, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." Her perfume drifted through the cool morning air, almost covering the lingering scent of fresh mulch that surrounded the decorative entrance. I looked past her toward the fields where my father once baled hay every June. Better circumstances would be me driving through my own gate. She gave a patient little laugh as though I were confused about something obvious. "Actually, this entrance now serves the entire community. We have invested significantly in improving the property." Improving. That word settled in my stomach like a stone. She pointed toward the stone monument, the landscaped flower beds, the guardhouse, and the paved roadway stretching toward what used to be our equipment shed. Everything looked polished, carefully planned, and completely out of place against the rolling Texas pasture. "Your father was approached several times over the years regarding community integration," she continued. "Unfortunately, circumstances changed before everything could be finalized." I frowned. My father never mentioned selling a single acre. Her expression never changed. Ownership matters can become complicated after someone passes away. Then she opened a leather folder and removed several neatly organized documents. She never offered them to me. Instead, she simply held them where I could see official-looking stamps and signatures. "Our attorneys have advised us that access to this property is currently restricted while various ownership questions are being resolved." Ownership questions. The words sounded rehearsed, polished, almost practiced. My father had spent 40 years making certain there were never questions about this land. Every tax bill had been paid before the due date. Every survey marker had been protected. Every boundary fence had been maintained exactly where county records placed it. Yet here stood a woman speaking as though decades of history had become nothing more than a paperwork inconvenience. "I would recommend that you avoid creating unnecessary conflict," Patricia said calmly. "The community has already purchased memberships, planned walking trails, and approved future amenities. Residents are excited about what this property will become." I looked through the gate again and noticed survey flags planted across the front pasture. Bright orange ribbons fluttered in the breeze where cattle once grazed. Construction stakes lined portions of the fence, and beyond them I spotted heavy equipment parked near the old machine barn. They were not planning something. They had already begun. Patricia slipped the folder back under her arm and nodded politely toward the guards. I truly hope we can handle this professionally, Mr. Walker. Sometimes it is healthier to let go of the past and embrace progress. As she turned and walked back toward her vehicle, I stood silently beside the gate my father had once built with his own hands, realizing the people standing in front of me were not acting like trespassers. They were acting like owners, and somehow they believed the law agreed with them. I stayed exactly where I was until Patricia's vehicle disappeared over the hill. Then I pulled out my phone and called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher listened patiently while I explained that I had been denied access to my family's property by private security guards. Less than 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived in a dusty pickup truck with county markings on the door. The smell of warm engine oil mixed with the scent of fresh-cut grass as he stepped out and adjusted his hat. He introduced himself as Deputy Ryan Foster, a man who looked old enough to remember when this road was still gravel. I explained everything from the beginning, pointing toward the barn, the windmill, and the oak tree that had stood on our land for decades. He listened without interrupting, then walked over to speak with the guards. Patricia returned before their conversation ended, carrying the same leather folder under her arm. She greeted the deputy by his first name with the kind of practiced familiarity that immediately caught my attention. She calmly handed him several documents while speaking in a measured voice I could not hear from where I stood. After several minutes, Deputy Foster walked back toward me with an expression that looked more uncomfortable than confident. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "based on the paperwork I have been shown today, this appears to be a civil property dispute. I cannot order them to let you onto the property." I stared at him in disbelief. "So they can lock me out of my own family farm, and nobody can do anything?" He let out a quiet sigh. "If you believe those records are inaccurate, you should speak with an attorney in the county recorder's office. Right now, my job is simply to keep the peace." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because he was rude, but because he genuinely believed his hands were tied. Before leaving, he handed me an incident number and quietly added, "Keep every document you have. Do not throw anything away." As his truck disappeared down the county road, one of the guards approached the gate carrying a large envelope. "You have been instructed to accept this," he said, sliding it through a narrow opening. Inside was a formal notice printed on expensive paper. Across the top, bold letters declared that unauthorized entry onto Oak Ridge Estates property could result in trespassing complaints. Reading those words while standing less than 50 feet from the porch where I had celebrated every childhood birthday felt almost unreal. I looked beyond the gate again and noticed even more changes. Fresh white fencing divided sections of the pasture into neat residential lots. Bright survey stakes stretched across the field where my father once harvested hay every summer. Near the old equipment shed, workers were measuring the ground while a compact excavator sat quietly beside stacks of construction materials. They were not slowing down because I had appeared. They were moving forward as though my family had never existed. Before climbing back into my truck, I walked over to the old oak tree that stood just outside the new entrance. Running my hand across its rough bark, I found the faded initials my father and I had carved there when I was 12 years old. Time had weathered the letters, but they were still there. The tree remembered exactly who we were, even if everyone else suddenly claimed they had forgotten. As I drove away, the metallic taste of frustration lingered in my mouth, but beneath it something else had begun to take shape. My father had never panicked when a fence broke or a storm rolled across the ranch. He always started with one simple rule. Before you fix the problem, you find out exactly who caused it and exactly how they thought they could get away with it. The next morning, I drove straight to the county recorder's office, carrying every document I had managed to gather from my father's house before coming back to the farm. The building smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and fresh coffee, the kind of place where history quietly sat inside filing cabinets instead of museums. I waited nearly an hour before a clerk helped me search for the property records. She was polite but careful, scrolling through digital maps before disappearing into a storage room to retrieve older files. When she returned, she frowned for just a second before placing several copies on the counter. "These are the most recent filings attached to the surrounding development," she explained. I studied every page, expecting to find a deed transferring ownership from my father. There was none. Instead, I found easement requests, subdivision maps for neighboring land, utility agreements, and planning documents connected to Oak Ridge Estates. My family's parcel appeared beside the development, but not inside it. That should have ended the matter. Yet somehow the entrance to the community now stood exactly where my father had always kept our front gate. Confused, I left with certified copies and drove directly to a local attorney whose office had handled rural property disputes for decades. His waiting room overlooked the courthouse square, and old framed survey maps decorated the walls. After reviewing my paperwork for nearly 40 minutes, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Mr. Walker, based on these records, I do not see evidence that your father sold the property. However, proving exactly how the association gained physical control over the entrance could require extensive litigation." He paused before adding words I did not want to hear. "These cases can last years if both sides refuse to settle." Years. Outside his office window, I could almost picture construction crews continuing their work while lawyers exchanged paperwork month after month. Every passing week would allow more roads, more landscaping, and more expensive improvements to spread across land that still carried my family's name in county records. I thanked him for his honesty and walked back to my truck with a folder full of answers that somehow created even bigger questions. During the drive toward town, my phone buzzed several times with messages from old neighbors who had heard I had returned. Most of them believed the stories circulating around the community. Some assumed my father had quietly sold the farm before he passed away. Others believed I had inherited legal problems too complicated to fix. Nobody sounded certain because nobody had actually seen the official records. They had only seen the polished entrance, the new pavement, and the security guards. Appearance had become more convincing than truth. Late that afternoon, I parked across the highway from the property and watched traffic move through the new gate. Contractors arrived with pickup trucks full of materials. Landscapers unloaded shrubs beside the stone monument. Delivery vehicles entered without hesitation, following directions posted beneath the polished community sign that had replaced my family's name. The more I watched, the clearer one fact became. Whoever planned this had expected me to react emotionally, rush into court, and fight every decision one step behind their schedule. But my father had spent a lifetime teaching me that solving problems on land always began with careful observation. You never repaired a fence until you understood why it failed. Sitting there with the engine off and the evening wind carrying the familiar scent of hay across the fields, I made a decision that surprised even me. Before I challenged anything, I was going to learn every inch of what had changed, every document that had been filed, and every assumption Patricia Collins believed nobody would ever question. 2 days later, I unlocked the front door of my father's farmhouse for the first time since the funeral. The house greeted me with the familiar scent of aged pine, worn leather, and the faint aroma of coffee that seemed permanently woven into the old kitchen walls. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight that slipped between the curtains, making the quiet rooms feel frozen in time. Nothing inside had changed the way the entrance outside had. His boots still rested beside the back door. His faded work jacket still hung from the same wooden hook. Even the old wall clock continued ticking with the slow, steady rhythm that had echoed through the house for as long as I could remember. I walked through every room without speaking, letting memories settle before heading toward the barn behind the house. The large sliding door groaned exactly the way it always had, filling the air with the comforting smell of cedar lumber, machine oil, and dry hay. My eyes drifted toward the workbench where my father had spent countless evenings repairing tools instead of replacing them. Then I remembered his words from the hospital. The blue metal toolbox. It still sat beneath the bench exactly where he said it would be, hidden behind a stack of weathered lumber that looked as though nobody had touched it in years. I pulled the heavy box into the light and brushed away a layer of dust. Inside were old wrenches, measuring tapes, survey stakes, and neatly folded envelopes held together with faded rubber bands. At the very bottom rested a blue folder that immediately caught my attention. Written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting were 5 simple words: "Property records do not lose." My heartbeat slowed as I carefully opened it. The first document was the original deed transferring the farm to my father decades earlier. Behind it sat certified survey maps showing every property corner, every fence line, every easement, and every legal description recorded with the county. Folded inside another sleeve was a professional boundary survey completed years after neighboring developments first appeared nearby. Bright red notes marked every monument buried beneath the soil, complete with coordinates and surveyor certifications. Then I found something even more surprising. My father had kept copies of letters exchanged with developers over several years. Every proposal asking him to sell access across the front of the property carried the same handwritten response in blue ink. Declined. One letter included a polite explanation that no entrance road would ever cross family land because alternative access already existed through neighboring parcels. Sitting beside those letters was a county engineering map highlighting existing utility easements that stopped several hundred feet short of our entrance. Suddenly, the polished stone monument, the guardhouse, and the paved roadway flashed through my mind. If these documents were accurate, none of those improvements belonged where they had been built. I spread every map across the workbench, aligning survey lines with photographs I had quietly taken from outside the gate. Fence corners matched perfectly. The old oak tree appeared exactly where the original survey placed it. The creek curved through the southern pasture exactly as it always had. Nothing about the land had moved. Only the people standing on it had changed their story. As the late afternoon sun filtered through the barn windows, illuminating the same workbench where my father had taught me to read measuring tapes before I was old enough to drive, I finally understood why he had spoken so calmly in the hospital. He had never expected me to win with anger. He had expected me to win with patience, because the truth had been waiting inside this barn all along, preserved in paper that remembered every boundary just as faithfully as the land itself. The next week became an exercise in patience instead of confrontation. Every morning before sunrise, I parked on a public road overlooking the property, poured a cup of black coffee into the same insulated mug my father had carried for years, and watched the development wake up. The air still smelled like fresh hay drifting across the pasture, but now it mixed with the scent of newly poured concrete and freshly cut lumber. Pickup trucks arrived just after 7 o'clock. Landscapers unloaded pallets of shrubs beside the stone entrance. Electricians installed decorative lighting along the new roadway. Every improvement they made quietly increased the value of something they believed already belonged to them. I resisted every urge to interrupt. Instead, I documented everything. I photographed construction equipment entering through the gate. I recorded the location of every new fence, every utility trench, every sidewalk, and every landscaped island. Using the certified survey from my father's blue folder, I compared each photograph with the legal boundary lines. The results were impossible to ignore. The guardhouse sat inside my family's recorded property line. The decorative entrance monument rested on land that had never been transferred. Even portions of the paved roadway crossed the original survey markers exactly where my father had protected them for decades. Wanting independent confirmation, I hired a licensed land surveyor named Michael Harper, a man with more than 30 years of experience working across rural Texas. We met before daylight one cool morning, carrying old maps, measuring equipment, and certified county records. He never rushed. Every corner marker was located exactly where the original survey indicated it would be. Several remained buried beneath the soil, untouched despite all the recent construction surrounding them. Michael compared the physical monuments with the recorded coordinates, occasionally nodding without saying much. By late afternoon, he folded the updated survey and looked directly at me. "These boundary markers have not moved," he said. "The property lines are exactly where they have always been." Hearing those words from an independent professional felt different than reading them on old paper. They carried the quiet certainty of measurable fact. Over the following days, I expanded my file even further. I requested certified copies of every planning application connected to Oak Ridge Estates, collected aerial photographs showing the property before construction began, and organized every tax record my father had carefully preserved over the years. The stack of evidence grew thicker with each passing afternoon, while the neighborhood outside continued investing more money into entrances, landscaping, lighting, and infrastructure. Patricia Collins occasionally drove past my parked truck without stopping. She looked confident every single time. I realized why. From her perspective, I had disappeared. I was no longer arguing at the gate, calling deputies, or demanding immediate answers. She probably assumed I had accepted defeat or decided the legal battle was too expensive to pursue. That assumption became the greatest advantage I could have asked for. My father always believed that the strongest foundation was the one nobody noticed until the entire structure depended on it. Sitting at his old workbench each evening, carefully organizing maps, surveys, letters, photographs, permits, and county records into neat binders, I finally understood exactly what he meant. They believed they were building a neighborhood. I knew they were building the evidence that would eventually prove, piece by piece, exactly how far they had crossed a boundary that had never changed. By the time our case finally reached the courthouse, nearly 4 months had passed since I first stood outside that unfamiliar gate listening to strangers tell me I no longer belonged on my own family's land. During those months, Oak Ridge Estates had continued expanding with complete confidence. Decorative streetlights now lined the entrance road. Fresh landscaping surrounded the stone monument. New sidewalks curved through what had once been open pasture. Every improvement represented another decision made under the assumption that nobody would ever question where the property lines actually stood. The courtroom itself was quiet, filled with the soft rustle of paper and the steady hum of the air conditioning. Patricia Collins sat across the room beside the association's attorneys, wearing the same calm expression I remembered from the day we first met at the gate. She smiled politely as though this hearing were simply another administrative step that would confirm everything she already believed. Our attorney did not begin with dramatic arguments or emotional speeches. Instead, he placed one document at a time before the court. First came the original deed transferring ownership to my father decades earlier. Then the certified tax records showing uninterrupted ownership year after year. Next came the historical survey maps preserved inside my father's blue folder. After that, Michael Harper testified under oath, explaining how every original survey monument remained exactly where it had been placed and how modern measurements matched the county records with remarkable precision. Large aerial photographs appeared on the courtroom screen, showing the property before construction began and then again after the entrance, guardhouse, roadway, and landscaping had been completed. Transparent boundary overlays left little room for interpretation. The stone entrance crossed onto my family's parcel. The guardhouse rested within our recorded boundary. Portions of the newly paved roadway extended across land that had never been conveyed, leased, or dedicated to the association. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter with every exhibit. For the first time since this ordeal began, Patricia's confident expression slowly disappeared. Her attorneys requested several brief recesses as they reviewed documents they had apparently never expected to confront. The judge asked careful questions about recorded easements, subdivision plats, and county filings. Every answer pointed back to the same simple conclusion. No recorded document had ever transferred ownership of my father's property or granted permanent authority to build the entrance where it now stood. After reviewing the complete record, the judge delivered a decision with calm precision. The association had no legal ownership interest in the portion of land occupied by the entrance improvements. The certified surveys, historical deeds, and county records established continuous ownership by the Walker family. The court ordered the association to cease unauthorized use of the affected property and directed the parties to proceed with appropriate legal remedies regarding the structures and improvements that had been placed there without legal authority. Those words were not loud, dramatic, or emotional. They did not need to be. Truth rarely arrives with fireworks. It arrives one verified record at a time. As we gathered our binders after the hearing, I glanced toward Patricia Collins. She avoided looking in my direction while quietly organizing papers that only hours earlier had seemed certain to protect her position. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon breeze carried the familiar scent of freshly cut grass across the square, reminding me of mornings on the farm with my father. Standing there beneath the bright Texas sky, I realized the land had never needed me to shout for it. It had simply needed someone willing to listen to what decades of honest records had been saying all along. 3 weeks after the court issued its ruling, I drove back down the same county road just after sunrise. The morning air carried the familiar scent of fresh hay again, and for the first time in months, it was not overwhelmed by the smell of new asphalt. The temporary construction fencing was gone. The guard booth stood empty, waiting to be removed. Crews carefully dismantled the decorative entrance stone by stone under revised property agreements, while survey flags marked the original boundary lines that had been there all along. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The certified records had already settled every question that mattered. As I slowly pulled my truck toward the entrance, I stopped beside the old oak tree and stepped out. The rough bark felt exactly the same beneath my hand as it had when I was a boy. Our faded initials were still there, weathered but unmistakable. I smiled because the tree had quietly outlasted every assumption made about the land around it. A few minutes later, I walked through the familiar steel gate that local craftsmen had restored using the original design my father built decades earlier. Hearing its hinges creak open again felt like hearing an old friend say welcome home. Beyond the entrance, the red barn still stood proudly against the morning sky. The windmill turned steadily in the breeze. The creek reflected golden sunlight exactly the way it had every summer morning of my childhood. Some things had never changed. They had only been hidden behind temporary distractions. Over the following months, I worked with county officials, surveyors, and neighboring property owners to restore the entrance in a way that respected every recorded boundary. The process required patience, cooperation, and plenty of paperwork, but that was exactly how lasting solutions were supposed to happen. Several nearby residents stopped by to introduce themselves after learning the full story. Many admitted they had believed the polished entrance more than the public records because appearances often seem more convincing than quiet facts. I never blamed them. Most people simply trusted what they could see. That was why preserving the truth mattered so much. Before leaving that afternoon, I carried a weathered wooden sign out of the barn. It had been stored carefully behind old shelves ever since the construction began. The white paint had faded, and one corner needed repair, but the carved letters were still easy to read. Walker Family Farm. I secured it beside the restored entrance where it had always belonged, stepped back a few feet, and watched the sunlight settle across the wood. For a long moment, I said nothing at all. There was nothing left to prove. My father had once told me that land remembers every honest hand that cares for it. And standing there, I finally understood what he meant. Deeds can be copied. Signs can be replaced. Roads can be rerouted. Stories can even be rewritten for a while. But truth has a remarkable habit of waiting patiently until someone is willing to uncover it. As I climbed back into my truck and drove slowly toward the farmhouse, the old windmill turned above the pasture. The porch came into view, and the familiar rhythm of home returned with every mile per hour. Justice had not arrived through anger or revenge. It arrived through patience, preparation, and the quiet strength of facts that never changed. Because in the end, the land had remembered exactly who had belonged there all along.